Welcome, everyone. It's a little after 7:30, so we're going to do just a little bit Jewish time tonight. You know, I waited a good 15, 20 seconds, but welcome to the third and final session of our series, our primer on Israel and Zionism in 2026. I think tonight really the purpose is, in the first two sessions we addressed two important issues or two important elements of the subject in a more substantive and historical way. So the first week, just to recap, we really discussed basically what Zionism is, and most importantly, for what we're going to talk about tonight, we really underscored the fact that Zionism is a movement of return, an indigenous people returning to the land of Israel, returning to its ancestral homeland, as opposed to a movement of foreign colonizers. We did that, and then last week we took a close look at the Nakba, which also is a central element in criticism of the state of Israel and Zionism today. So now that we've dealt with those two important elements, what we're going to do today is, in a more applied way, is we're going to consider directly, we're going to stare right in the face of what today we would call anti-Zionism, to understand what it is. And really we're going to do four things this evening. First, we're going to define it. And when I say define it, we're going to define it vis-a-vis anti-Semitism, what's the relationship there? And then we're going to draw a contrast between what we might call old anti-Zionism, which was predominantly Jewish, and new anti-Zionism, which is predominantly not. So we're going to define it. We're going to talk about the origins of this recent anti-Zionism. As we shall see, it did not appear organically, naturally. There was something that was very specifically and deliberately designed. And then third, we're going to ask the question, given that we know that this anti-Zionism is full of holes, it's ahistorical, it doesn't have a lot of substance to it, why does it have such an appeal? Who does it appeal to and why? And then finally, I'm going to suggest some effective ways to respond to it, and I can draw from some of my own experience being on a North American university campus for the last X number of years. So that's what we're going to do. This is very ambitious. Buckle up, settle in. That's what we're going to do tonight. Before we dive into it, though, I do want to add one or two comments from last week about the notion of the Nakba. Now, as you recall from last week, Nakba is an Arabic word which means catastrophe, and it has come to mean the displacement of Arabs in Palestine during the War of Independence, and really today, what it morphed into is the birth of what is today known as the Palestinian refugee problem. So I just want to reiterate, or just focus for a second, that from the vantage point of 1948 and 1949, during the Israel War of Independence, we really have two Arab responses, two very different Arab responses to the beginnings of Jewish statehood. And we could describe it very simply: to stay or to go. During the War of Independence, there were many Arabs who fled for one reason or another. There were many who chose to stay. And those who chose to stay, basically, in not too long a time, they settled in and became Israeli citizens. Those who left, actually, among those who chose to go, they divide into two categories. There were those who left and then returned, and they also became eventually Israeli citizens, Israeli Arabs or Palestinian Israelis. But there are others who continue to stay away and many wound up in Palestinian refugee camps. And this really is the beginning of this refugee problem. The one aspect of this we have to note, and we really have to underline, and for some reason it's something that gets forgotten, is typically when you have a population of refugees, wherever they're refugees from, they're typically absorbed into a neighboring country or another country. But in the case of the Palestinian refugees, in other words, those who left and chose not to return, many of them were temporarily interned in Palestinian refugee camps, but the neighboring countries, especially Syria, Egypt, Jordan, they actually took steps to avoid absorbing these refugees. They wanted them to remain in the refugee camps as a political tool, as leverage against the new state of Israel. And many of those Palestinians and their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, it is a much larger number now, are living in those refugee camps in very difficult conditions, but not because of the existence of the state of Israel, but because of the strategies and policies of Israel's adversarial neighbors. It's an odd situation. The other thing we have to note as well, and this is also something which in the, let's call it in the narrative of the anti-Israel movement, what gets left out is for almost 20 years after the founding of the state, the West Bank belonged to Jordan, the Gaza Strip belonged to Egypt, all the way until 1967, during which time the amount of discussion about the possibility of Palestinian statehood was zero. There was no talk about it. And then when it came under Israeli control, then it started up. And a lot of this problem didn't just happen spontaneously. As documents became available, we get a clear understanding of why this refugee situation took place and why there was no talk of statehood. If you look at your handout, I just want to read a couple of texts. I think with a controversial or hotly debated question, it's important to bring receipts, not just to make a claim, but to actually bring evidence. So look, text number 1, this is a report by a United Nations mediator toward the end of the War of Independence. Quote, "Hundreds of thousands have left voluntarily. So alarming was the exodus, Arab leaders asked neighboring countries to deny visas. Per the Secretary of the Arab League office in London, this wholesale exodus was due partly to the belief of the Arabs, encouraged by the boastings of an unrealistic Arabic press and the irresponsible utterances of some of the Arab leaders that it could only be a matter of weeks that before the Jews were defeated by the armies of the Arab states and the Palestinian Arabs enabled to re-enter and retake possession of their country." That's a United Nations report, presumably neutral, probably a report that's not exactly by someone who's not exactly favoring Israel. So that's one. The second one has to do with Haifa specifically. Haifa was a place where Arabs began to flee long before statehood, or the beginning of 1948. And look, and I'll quote, this is a British police report from Haifa in April of 1948. Quote, this is text number 2. "Every effort is being made by the Jews to persuade the Arab populace to stay and carry on with their normal lives, to get their shops and businesses open, and to be assured that their lives and interests will be safe. Huge numbers have been offered resettlement after the war in Israel, conditioned on peace agreements, and have refused." So in this debate of why they left and why they didn't come back, there is a point of view which wants to blame Israel aggression entirely. Clearly, that was not the case, because this is a British report and a United Nations report. This is more or less, this is neither Israeli nor Arab or Palestinian. This is these are neutral observers making these points of view. The point is that from the outset, the problem of the Palestinians, it emanated from the start from an unwillingness of many Arabs in Palestine simply to accept the reality of a Jewish state there, which in many ways is really the heart of the problem right now. I think just to make one last point about that is one of the most cogent and really striking understanding of the Palestinian mentality since 1948, really to the present, was a comment made by the Shah of Iran in one of his last interviews on 60 Minutes before he was exiled and overthrown. So this is text number 3. Incidentally, if you want to see the whole interview, this is all available on YouTube. He's being interviewed by Mike Wallace. If you just Google or search YouTube for Shah of Iran 60 Minutes, this interview will come up, and I'll just quote this short passage. Quote, Text number 3. The Palestinians obviously have the sympathy of many, many people around the world, prosecuted people, that should be persecuted people, stateless people, people who are looking for a home or something. You know, the empathy that the Jews had when they were searching for a home. But our good Palestinian friends must know that there is a limit to how far they can go and bully the world by terrorism and blackmailing. They should open their eyes and reassess their situation if there is a hierarchy and someone in command to start a new policy, because the actual one is going to lead them nowhere. He said that in 1976, and 50 years later, everything he said in that interview turned out to be exactly right. The tragedy of the Palestinians, much of it surrounds the fact that they seem less interested in creating their own state than they do in destroying an existing state. And that's a big problem. But it's also at the heart of what has now come to be known as anti-Zionism. So let's turn to that. That will be our topic for this evening. So let me start by defining what we mean by anti-Zionism. And I want to get two things out of the way right away, because there are two aspects to this problem that come up a lot. And to my mind, I think they muddy the question a little bit. They're a little bit of a distraction. They're an unnecessary complication. So let's get two things out of the way. First of all, the relationship between criticism of the state of Israel, its policy, its government, and leaders on the one hand, and anti-Zionism on the other. I'll be very blunt about this. Criticizing the policies of the state of Israel, or the prime minister, or the government, or whatever, that in and of itself, per se, is not anti-Zionism, and it's certainly not anti-Semitism. The line is, where it crosses over, is the moment those criticisms are used as the basis to delegitimize the state. As soon as it becomes, there are all of these problematic policies or leaders or Bibi or even Ben-Gvir or whatever, when that turns into, therefore the Jewish state should not exist, that becomes anti-Zionism. That becomes anti-Zionism. And to be said, yeah, there are real problems, and this, the policies of the state of Israel is something we can and should debate, and we're really good at it. Both in Israel and outside of Israel, we're Jews, we're very good. I think the confusion, where it gets muddled, is there are problematic policies of the Israeli government, which, how can I describe them? They're a blemish on the face of Israeli democracy. But they're not the totality of that democracy. They're a problem, but they're not the whole thing. Okay. So that's the first thing I want to say. And one other thing is that sometimes where it becomes even more problematic is criticizing policies or government leaders is sometimes used as a cover between someone who is in fact anti-Zionism. You know, someone who says, no, I'm not anti-Zionist or I'm just criticizing government policies. Yes, you are criticizing government policies, but if you're using it as an excuse to delegitimize, that's really, that's the telling part, not the criticism. Okay. In the longer scheme of things, the mentality, the Jewish attitude which says, apologetically, if we could just do better, then the antagonism against us would diminish. Or in this case, if Israel could do better, then the antagonism would diminish. That's something that Jews have hoped is true for centuries. But the disappointing part is it's not. I'll share a personal story, because I really kind of believed that myself, probably until 2020, or maybe 2021, until the following story happened. I really was of the mind that the problem wasn't Israel, the problem was Bibi and his policies, and if that changed. So in 2020, just before lockdown, a local member of the U.S. Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives, came to my campus to speak. My campus happens to be located in her district, in her congressional district. Without naming names, let's say her name is let's call her Sharita Lateef, let's say is her name, okay? Anyway, she came to campus. She wasn't speaking about Israel and the Palestinians. She came to speak about student debt, which is a big problem for Wayne students. Afterwards, I went up to her, I introduced myself, I told her who I was, I told her what my job was, and I said, on one foot, just tell me what you think of the situation in Israel and the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians. And she said, quote, "The problem isn't Israel, the problem is Bibi." She said exactly what I thought at the time. And I was actually very encouraged by that, but unfortunately the story has a but. A year and a half later, when Bibi was voted out of office and a new government came in, I, remembering what, Congresswoman Lateef, let's say, had said, I thought, okay, well, her rhetoric should diminish a little bit. It should cool down. The opposite happened. She doubled down. And I don't know if she was making it up when she talked to me. I don't know if she changed her mind. Whatever the case, this notion that if Israel does better, somehow the animosity will diminish. This was a moment when Israel was doing better, and it didn't make things better. It actually made things worse. So the criticism of the state, in many ways, it's a separate question. And to mix it in together seamlessly with the problem of anti-Zionism, in some ways it's mixing apples and oranges, or at least it's mixing, navel oranges with seeds. I don't know exactly how that analogy works. So that's the first thing. The other thing is, the other question I want to clear up from the start is the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. The question which comes up, is anti-Zionism a form of anti-Semitism? Let's just address this one right now so we can move on. Now, the reason this question is a question, and the reason this question doesn't have a simple one-word answer, yes-no answer, is because we use the term anti-Semitism. Or more broadly, the term anti-Semitism is used in two different ways. There is a colloquial way. We use the term anti-Semitism as a catch-all for all forms of Jew hatred from antiquity to the present. So there was anti-Semitism, in the world of the Bible, and in ancient Rome, and in ancient Greece, and so on, and Martin Luther was anti-Semitic. That's a colloquial way. But there's also a historical and scholarly definition of anti-Semitism which refers specifically to racial anti-Semitism. The term was coined by a German sociologist named Wilhelm Marr, who was redefining Jews as a race that was trying to destroy other races. So we have that broad definition as basically synonymous with all forms, a catch-all for all forms of antipathy towards Jews, and a more specific one. So if you're referring to the more specific definition of anti-Semitism, then no, anti-Zionism is not a form of anti-Semitism because it's not racist in nature. It's political in nature, it's other things. But if you're referring to the broader catch-all definition of anti-Semitism, then anti-Zionism is definitely a form of anti-Semitism. So what it comes down to is most people who are part of this anti-Zionism movement, they are using anti-Semitism in the broader colloquial sense. So yes, their anti-Zionism is certainly anti-Semitic, but they're pretending, or they're using as cover this specific definition. Now, a way to get around that whole confusion is simply to, instead of talking about whether anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism, asking it a different way, is anti-Zionism a form of Jew hatred? And the answer there is yes. That's not a difficult question, without a doubt. Now, why do I say that so definitively? Because anti-Zionism as a movement that we will define more specifically in a moment, it shares in common the central features of other forms of Jew hatred from past and present. And what are these other forms? What are these features of Jew hatred through the ages? First, redefining something about Jews, or the Jewish community, or in this case, the Jewish state. So Jew hatred in the world of early Christendom redefined Jews simply from infidels or non-Christians into servants of the devil, the quintessential evil. The racist anti-Semitism of the 19th century didn't just redefine Jews as a race, it redefined Jews as a race that was trying to destroy all other races. Or actually, Hitler's variation on that was that Jews are not a race, Jews are an anti-race that is disrupting the natural racial competition of the world, of society, of humanity. But it's redefining. Zionism has been redefined as the worst things that the worst words that people know today, as colonialist, as racist, and the state that emerged out of Zionism has been defined also as the worst things: apartheid, involved in ethnic cleansing, and of course, genocidal. That is a common feature of Jew hatred. You take something Jewish and you equate it with the worst things there are. In league with the devil, colonialist. Okay. So that's one feature. Secondly is Jew hatred has often reflected much less something actually about Jews. It reflects something more about non-Jewish society. Typically, it reflects a certain uncertainty or anxiety, not in the Jewish world, but outside the Jewish world. The way one historian once said it is, as a phenomenon, Jew hatred, Jews are the object of it, but it's really more part of non-Jewish history than it is part of Jewish history, even though, of course, it's part of Jewish history, because we're the objects of it. So what do I mean by this anxiety? For early Christians, I use another example, their animosity towards Jews stemmed from their anxiety about why isn't everyone becoming Christian? Why are people resisting this? Why isn't everyone Christian? Particularly when a rival religion called Islam appeared suddenly. Christians had to explain that disparity between what they believed should be true and what was actually true. And when it comes to anti-Zionism, there's a larger anxiety in the Muslim and Arab world in the Middle East about, first of all, the decline of the Muslim world as a powerful centerpiece of world politics and society and culture, how to explain the decline, how to explain the way that the Muslim world, after being dominant for centuries, is suddenly subordinated to the European world, as in a position of subservience or inferiority. So, Jew hatred reflects something broader, a broader anxiety beyond the Jewish community. Anti-Zionism is no exception. Third, and this is probably the most familiar, Jew hatred is almost always conspiratorial in nature. Jews are in league with the devil to destroy Christianity, to drive good from the world. That might be the original conspiracy. It might also be the reason why every conspiracy in the Western world, even though it doesn't start out as a Jewish conspiracy, eventually becomes one, because that's the original conspiracy theory. It's conspiratorial in nature. Anti-Zionism is equally conspiratorial. And finally, Jew hatred has an element of singling out Jews in some way. Jews are not just different, they're the worst kind of different. They're not just non-believers, they are the ultimate antagonists and enemies of everything good. And anti-Zionism has singled out Zionism and the Jewish state as being the worst state in the world. So, to keep things simple, whether Zionism is anti-Semitism, that's a conversation that's more of a distraction. The real way to say it is that anti-Zionism, without a doubt, is a form of Jew hatred. Okay, now that we've got those two things out of the way. When we talk about anti-Zionism, we're talking about what I would call the anti-Zionist Big Five. There really are 5 claims against Zionism and the State of Israel, and I've alluded to them already, but let me just list them. The number one that we spoke about the first week is colonialism. Zionism is a form of colonialism. Here it's also important to note that originally the claim was colonialism. Later, it became settler colonialism. In a moment, I will explain to you why it was necessary for anti-Zionists to add the word settler there, put a pin there. Zionism is racist. That's based on it really found expression in a 1975 United Nations resolution. And the State of Israel is an ethno-state engaged in apartheid, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. Okay. Those are basically the big five. That's really what's part of this anti-Zionism. Okay. It's also important to distinguish between opposition or objection or criticism of Zionism now and objections and criticisms of Zionism prior to the founding of the state, or really even a century ago. And in order to kind of simplify this, to distinguish between what I've called old and new anti-Zionism, there is a young historian, actually a young anthropologist named Adam Lewis Klein. He's an anthropology PhD at McGill University. He came up with the following semantic device in order to make it easier to distinguish between old and new anti-Zionism. If you look at your handout on the bottom of page 1, there's anti-Zionism with a hyphen, anti-Zionism, and there's anti-Zionism without a hyphen. Now, this is entirely just a semantic choice, just to clarify the following. There are older expressions of opposition to or rejection of Zionism, which mainly emanated from within the Jewish community. This is the old anti-Zionism. Really, there were four in particular. In other words, there were four groups within Jewish society, within world Jewry, who objected to Zionism or rejected Zionism as a movement. And the four were, and I'll tell you what the four were, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about each one. First, there was classical Reform Judaism. Secondly, there was ultra-Orthodox or Haredi, Hasidic Judaism. We'll lump all those together, hyper-traditional Judaism. And then there are two forms of diaspora Jewish nationalism, one of which is called autonomism. I don't really have time to go into it, but I really want to mainly deal with the other one, Bundism, the Jewish Bund. Now, of these, the Jewish Bund is very important because today there are Jews who are part of this new anti-Zionism who see themselves as the continuation of the Bund. So it's important to make this distinction. So, what can we say about these four kinds of old anti-Zionism? What do they have in common? Well, first of all four of them, without exception, without ambivalence, without hesitation, they all recognize the fact that the land of Israel was the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people, and they all recognized and they all agreed that Jews are indigenous to Israel. None of them questioned that in the least. Their opposition stemmed from not challenging or questioning the Jewish connection to Israel, but the manner in which, in the 20th century, Zionism as a movement was proceeding towards statehood. They objected for different reasons. Let's take them one at a time. Look at page 2 of your handout. I gave you an excerpt from a couple of them. So originally, the Reform movement in Judaism, especially in Europe, but also in America, was anti-Zionist. So, for example, in response to the first Zionist Congress, organized by Theodor Herzl in 1897, a group of Reform rabbis in Germany called the Protest-Rabbiner, meaning the protesting rabbis, they made the following statement. This is text number 6. What more can one say? If people are so naive as to believe that West European Jews will hand over their money to purchase Palestine from the Turks, who were still ruling in Palestine, and to create a Jewish organization, and here's the key phrase, that will reverse the entire development of the Jewish nation. 1,800 years ago, meaning the destruction of the temple that we will commemorate tomorrow night. 1,800 years ago, history made its decision regarding Jewish nationhood through the dissolution of the Jewish state and the destruction of the temple The Zionists want to provide an internationally guaranteed place to call home. In other words, from the vantage point of Reform Judaism, Zionism was something retrograde. It was turning back the natural development of the Jews. This classical Reform believed that Jews were a religious community and their national identity was the country in which they lived. They were believers in citizenship, and they were believers in acculturation, and they were believers that Jews be citizens wherever they were. You know, there would be Germans of the Jewish faith or Americans of the Jewish faith. And that was canonized in early Reform Judaism. Here's the thing, though. That mentality within the Reform movement barely lasted a generation. By the beginning of the 20th century, Reform congregations, first in America and then in Europe, began to change their mind on this question. Now, it was partly in response to rising anti-Semitism during the 1920s and the 1930s, but it was mainly because of the conception, first in America and then in Europe, of what today we would call a hyphenated identity. That it was possible to be loyal to the Jews as a nation and loyal and patriotic to American at the same time. For example, you could be Irish American, fight for home rule in Ireland, but still be a patriotic American. And the same way, you could be a Zionist wanting a Jewish return and the recreation of a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel without compromising your loyalty to America. So by the 1930s, or certainly by the 1940s, the vast majority of Reform congregations had abandoned this rejection of Zionism, were no longer anti-Zionist, and became Zionists. In our own community, that's the difference I think I mentioned before between Temple Beth El and Temple Israel. Temple Beth El was really one of the last Reform congregations to come around. You know, the rabbi of Temple Beth El, Leo Franklin, during the 1940s, he was the head of an organization called the American Council for Judaism, which in 1942 was still against the creation of a Jewish homeland. Eventually, they came around. Temple Israel was founded on the premise that Reform Judaism and Zionism were in harmony with one another. Okay, so that old anti-Semitism was gone by the 1940s. The second kind, this religious, this Haredi, Hasidic, ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionism, that was premised on a theological problem. They didn't like the fact that the Jewish state was being built through human means and human endeavors instead of waiting for the Messiah to do it. So look at text number 7. One of the first to object to Zionism as a movement, this was in 1900, was a rabbi from Lublin, a Hasidic rabbi from Lublin, Poland, whose name was Tzadok Cohen Rabinowitz. This is text number 7. A voice was heard on high, a voice of lamentation from the imperial city of Vienna. That's where the Third Zionist Congress was. In a matter relating to all Israel, it concerns the sect that has arisen recently under the name of Zionists. What comes next, the language which comes next, is the language of excommunication. It's the language of cherem. Zionism, they believed, was a form of heresy. What Jews are supposed to do is to continue to wait for the Mashiach to come to lead the Jews back to the land of Israel. You remember at the end of Fiddler on the Roof? They're evicted from Anatevka, and someone turns to the rabbi and say, wouldn't this be a great time for the Mashiach to come? And the rabbi says, we're just going to have to wait for him somewhere else. That was basically, well, black letter law in Judaism, and the fact that Zionists were hastening the end, were ignoring that, and the fact that most Zionists were secular Jews, that was a problem. Most Haredi, Hasidic, ultra-Orthodox Jews, or well, most Haredi and Hasidic Jews, they changed their mind by the end of the 1940s or the 1950s. First of all, the appearance of Mizrahi Zionism brought many Orthodox Jews into the Zionist fold, and certainly by the end of the Holocaust, the majority of these Jews had embraced the possibility of Zionism. Either they thought that the Jewish state, though secular, would be the first step towards the Messianic age, or they believed that a secular Jewish state, though secular, would be better even for religious Jews than living in a non-Jewish state. They came to believe that. Plus the fact that the vast majority of Orthodox and Haredi and ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic Jews were killed during the Holocaust. And among those who were left, most embraced Zionism. Sometimes it took some time. So for example, the Lubavitcher Hasidim did not recognize the state of Israel right away. Within a couple of years within a couple of years after the founding of the state, the Lubavitcher Rebbe said, we accept the state. He actually ordered all of his Hasidim in Israel to serve in the army. It took some time. Now, so you're asking, but at these anti-Israel rallies, what about those Hasidic Jews and Haredi Jews who are there still? They're actually the radical fringe of that world, the Satmar Hasidim. These are the most anti-modern of Hasidic Jews. They reject everything modern, including the modern state of Israel, and their response to the founding of the state, look at text number 8, a statement by the Satmar Rebbe, Yoel Teitelbaum. This one's a little cringy, so brace yourself. Text number 8. It's talking about, basically, he's writing this in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, and he writes, all the adversity, war, and horror that happened to Jews there transpired for the sake of founding this same state, in other words, Israel. If they, meaning Zionists, had abandoned the idea of a state, there certainly would not have been war and adversity, and the United Nations would have been able to maintain order, and none from Israel would have been killed. Thus they, meaning Zionists, are the cause of war and suffering. They blamed the Holocaust on Zionism. Yeah, that did not play well. If you've ever read the novel The Chosen, you know, the Reb Saunders is the Satmar, based on the Satmar Rebbe. He says this in that book. It's a difficult moment. But they are a fringe. They are a minority within that world. The vast majority of religious Jews around the world support the state of Israel and support the concept of Zionism. Okay, lastly, the Bund. Now, the Bund was a Jewish socialist movement that began in 1897. Here's why it's problematic for Jewish anti-Zionists today to say that they are an extension or continuation of the Jewish Bund, for two reasons. First of all, you know, the Bund was originally founded as the Jewish wing of the Russian Socialist Party. In 1897, it was founded with the goal of bringing Russian socialism to the Jewish street. But 6 years later, and one of the reasons that wing of the party came into being is the Russian Socialist Party, in response to pogroms in Russia during the 1880s, condemned the pogroms as counter-revolutionary. And there were Jews who became socialists on the assumption that social revolution will eliminate anti-Semitism. However, a second wave of pogroms began in Russia and Romania in 1903, and in this case, the Russian Socialist Party endorsed the pogroms as a blow against Jewish capitalism and expected Jewish socialists to agree with them. And at this point, the Bund seceded from the Russian Socialist Party and became a separate party focused on separate Jewish interests. Now, they were still at odds with Zionism. Their operating principle was dokite, a Yiddish word which means focusing on the here and now as opposed to building a state, you know, some fantastical notion of building a Jewish state. But the Bund did not exactly see other socialists as their allies. They were a separate organization who thought they were doing what was best for Jews. Now, in addition, like religious Jews, the vast majority of Bundists did not last through the end of the Second World War. Those Bundists who were in Russia and were in the Soviet Union, well, they were basically, the organization was illegalized, was banned by Lenin and then by Stalin. No Jewish, all there was Soviet communism, no Jewish socialism. And then if those who were in Poland or not in the Soviet Union were killed during the Holocaust. So the Bund as a movement there were very few Bundists left after the Second World War. So whatever aspirations, that mentality, or however they envision the Jewish future, history proved them to be, well, a tad on the, let's say, a little bit short-sighted. In other words, those old forms of Zionism, either they're basically gone, or eventually they embraced the idea of Zionism. Incidentally, the same time that the Bund was founded, or the Bund seceded from the Russian Socialist Party, there were many Jewish socialists who actually became Zionists at that point. They didn't give up their socialist ideas, but what they said was, in light of this anti-Semitic nature of the Russian Socialist Party, we still want to bring about social revolution, but for Jews, social revolution will only work within the framework of a Jewish state, and they became labor Zionists. They combined the ideas of socialism and the ideas of Zionism. That's Ben-Gurion in a nutshell. Okay, but to reiterate, what they all had in common is they all recognized the fact that the land of Israel was the Jewish homeland. They just didn't think that building a Jewish state was the proper course. And in defense of the Bund at the beginning of the 20th century, it was a pretty fantastical notion. The idea of a Jewish state in 1900 was so distant and remote. It would be like me suggesting, let's go build a Jewish state on the moon. It was just something that no one thought would be possible. As it became a reality, more and more Jews, even more and more of these Jews, came around. And that is one of the crucial differences. This old anti-Zionism had its reasons for opposing Zionism. The new anti-Zionism, well, it opposed for very, very different reasons. So let me say a few words about where this new anti-Zionism comes from. Now, like I said, this new anti-Zionism did not appear out of a vacuum. Actually, it is the result of a very deliberate program of propaganda. Now, before we go on here, I have to say that propaganda, is not to be minimized. Propaganda is very effective. To really understand the power of propaganda, let me illustrate it, or let me introduce it to you by telling you what's called the string test. I don't know if you've ever heard of the string test. The string test is a way of evaluating the strength of an argument with the following analogy, that an argument is analogized to be a painting, and the evidence supporting an argument is the string that hangs the painting on a wall. And the notion is, the heavier the painting, the thicker the string. The larger the argument, the larger the claim, the more evidence you need to support it. So, let me take an example from the series. In the first session, I made the very large claim that Jews are indigenous to the land of Israel, but I supported that claim with a lot of evidence, specific, concrete evidence. I mean, I hope you see it that way as well. I think I did. The nature of propaganda and what makes it very effective is propaganda will make a propagandist, or propaganda will consist of a sweeping large argument with very little evidence. Propagandists count on the fact that most people who read and most people who listen to someone, they're only listening to the substance of what's being said, and only a minority of people actually ask the question, how do you know that? Let alone investigate it. And this is particularly true when the propaganda is built around a conspiracy, because the nature of a good conspiracy theory is it can't be proven, and so it's hard. Most people don't refute it. Most people don't refute it. So the propaganda itself is well written, it's coherent, it is a powerful argument laid out in a very effective way with very compelling and accessible prose with very little evidence. Just to make this clear, let me give you one example of propaganda built on a conspiracy theory. It doesn't have directly to do with this, but maybe one that's more familiar. Since the 1990s, there has been a lot of well, there's been a growing conspiracy theory about the Clintons, Bill and Hillary Clinton. It all really stems from a book written in the 1990s called Clinton Cash, which is basically detailing in detail all of the sordid things that the Clintons did. Money here and corruption here and whatever. Now, you can like the Clintons or not, but I happened to read that book, and the argument in that book is very compelling. It's written by a journalist who really knows how to write, but I'm someone who doesn't just ignore the footnotes. I'm someone, I guess it's my occupational hazard. The footnotes in support of this argument, I actually looked them up, tried to follow these footnotes back to the source, and you have a footnote to a website, to a speech, to a website, to a speech. There was no substance to any of it. There was no concrete anything. It looked like this powerful, compelling argument, but it was a house of cards. It was a heavy painting with barely any string at all, very flimsy. And anti-Zionism is something very similar. So it begins with propaganda, and really it began with Soviet propaganda. Anti-Zionism really begins with Soviet propagandists a little bit during the 1920s and the 1930s, but more so from the late 1940s on. Now, there were reasons for it, two in particular. First of all, Stalin, Stalin could be a little vindictive. Stalin did not like to be refused. Stalin assumed in 1948 that the state of Israel, being a socialist state, was going to ally with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union recognized the state of Israel before the United States did. And then, to his great chagrin and disappointment, the state of Israel allied with the United States. And remember, this is during the Cold War, and Stalin was not happy, and he also, his government, his officials, his bureaucracy, needed a reason to explain that. And there was born a series of claims about Zionism, why Zionism is part of a Western conspiracy against the Soviet Union. And when the principal text was written by a Soviet propagandist writer named Yuri Ivanov. Look at your handout at the bottom of page 2, text number 9. Yuri Ivanov in the 1960s, he wrote a book called Caution Zionism. Now, this book is readily available. Not only can you buy it online, but it is available online in its entirety with no paywall. It's so available. It's in multiple languages. And if you're going to read it, just remember, the argument is very compelling. You have to keep reminding yourself. I have to keep reminding myself, this is propaganda. There's no evidence to any of this. But I'll give you an example of something he says. This is text number 9. Zionism arose as an attempt of the pro-imperialist Jewish bourgeoisie to reestablish the control now by bourgeois sections lost by the leaders of the Jewish community over the Jewish masses, to retard, in the word of Lenin, their undeniable progressive assimilation with the surrounding population, in order to create in each country and on an international scale a political and physical reserve capable of being utilized in the interests of Zionism's chief ally and senior partner, namely the imperialist Jewish bourgeoisie. Zionism is an imperialist, is a bourgeois imperialist plot, conspiracy. That is a powerful sentence, a powerful claim. You can comb through this book and find no evidence for it, but didn't that sound good? If you didn't know anything about this and you just started reading Caution Zionism, you could get swept away by this. It's compelling. It's very compelling. Now, one of the things that's characteristic of this book, of this first stage of this Soviet anti-Zionism, is one of the main claims is that Zionism is a form of colonialism, as we've heard. But very quickly, by the 1950s or the 1960s, it became clear that the claim that Zionism is a form of colonialism was very difficult to substantiate. for anyone who knew anything about what colonialism is, mainly because one of the central defining features of colonialism, be it British colonialism or French colonialism or any kind of colonialism, is the expropriation of economic resources from the place that's being colonized to bring them back to the home country. So whether it's oil from the Middle East back to some European country, or whether it's spices from India back to Great Britain, or, I don't know, diamonds from Africa, or rubber from Southeast Asia, a big part of what makes colonialism is the expropriation of economic resources. And it was pretty clear that Zionist settlements were never doing that. First of all, these were people who had no intention of going back, who really weren't interested in what was happening back there. And secondly, they were settling a part of the world that didn't really have any resources. There's no oil there. What resources were they settling back? That made no sense. And so they modified the claim of colonialism into a claim called settler colonialism, which of course is what it's now referred to in the anti-Zionist rhetoric. And the difference here is now what makes it colonialist is not the expropriation of economic resources, but the very building of settlements, of colonial settlements, displacing the local population. And that's what's going to give it some staying power. Now, just to give you a sense of where this original Soviet anti-Zionism was going, look, I'll give you two examples. Look at text number 10. This is a statement by Yuri Andropov, chairman of the Soviet KGB in 1972. This is text number 10. We need to, the way he said it, this is a recently declassified document that historians were able finally to get their hands on. We need to instill a Nazi-style hatred of Jews throughout the Islamic world and turn this weapon of the emotions into a terrorist bloodbath against Israel and its main supporter, the United States. So in addition to discrediting the state of Israel or Zionism as a tool of Western imperialism, the Soviet Union also had a strategic aim. They were going to use anti-Zionism to get Arab and Muslim countries to ally with the Soviet bloc. Now, they needed some way to do it, because most Arab and Muslim countries, Turkey for a long time was an exception, these were countries that were governed. They were theocracies governed by Islam. They were traditional. They valued religion. The Soviet Union was anti-religious, and they needed a way to make this alliance. Anti-Zionism and animosity towards the state of Israel was a way to do it, part of a Soviet expansion strategy. Okay? It also permeated to Soviet emigre intellectuals. Look at text number 11. This is Vladimir Yankelevich, who was born in the Soviet Union, but he grew up in Paris, and he was part of the Cultural Revolution in Paris in the late 1960s. This is what he wrote in 1971. He was a philosopher, but also an activist. He says, quote, "Anti-Zionism is an incredible opportunity because it gives us permission and even the right and even the duty to be anti-Semitic in the name of democracy." He's actually equating the two. He's removing all that muddledness back then. Anti-Zionism is justified anti-Semitism finally within everyone's reach. He says finally because in 1971, there were 25 years in which sympathy for Jews post-Holocaust made it difficult to be antagonistic towards Jews. But he's saying, now we have the new language. We can be antagonistic towards Jews without being equated with Hitler. It's a nice workaround. It is the authorization to be democratically anti-Semitic. What if the Jews were Nazis themselves? It would be wonderful. Now, that specifically, that's something that's familiar to us because, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, there were anti-Semites, Jew haters, who tried to deny that the Holocaust happened. Holocaust denial was an abject failure, even though there are still people who believed it. No serious thinking person believes that anymore. There was a court case in Great Britain where Deborah Lipstadt actually was sued for libel for claiming that David Irving was a Holocaust denier, and she won the case. It's on the record. So as Holocaust denial, its effectiveness proved inadequate. What they replaced it with was something called Holocaust inversionism. Now, Holocaust inversionism says, yes, the Jews were victims of the Holocaust, but that's terrible. But what they did after, just like Yankelevich said, is they're turned around and are perpetrating a Holocaust against someone else. That's Holocaust inversionism, and it is an element of this Soviet anti-Zionism. So that's really the first step. Eventually, the ideas of Soviet anti-Zionism, they permeated, they were absorbed into the Arab world and the Muslim world, particularly in the Middle East, but not only in the Middle East, throughout the Muslim world, especially by a Muslim writer, an Arab writer whose name was Fayez Sayegh, who wrote a book in 1965 called Zionist Colonialism in Palestine. He's going to elaborate on this whole question of settler colonialism. He's going to take these Soviet ideas and basically present them to an Arabic reading audience. This book was originally published in Arabic, and it became sort of the manifesto for anti-Zionism in the Arab world. All right? I'm going to read a little bit of it. I'm just going to remind you one more time that the argument is very compelling. The evidence is not there. In addition, this book epitomizes the way in which anti-Zionism is ahistorical. He is going to ignore large swaths of history in order to make this argument. So he says, I'll read a little bit. I don't know if I'm going to read all of this. I'll read a little bit of it, because I want to talk about some other things as well. Okay, quote, this is text number 12. 3 essential features in particular differentiated Zionist colonization in Palestine from European colonization elsewhere in Asia and Africa, and called for Zionist innovations. In other words, what he's going to do is he's going to differentiate colonialism from settler colonialism, and why Zionist settler colonialism, even though it's not regular colonialism, it's actually worse. Now keep in mind, one of the things he's going to do is to downplay the evils of European colonialism, which the irony of that is just, well, it's ironic. Okay, so what are the 3 differences? 1, other European settlers who had gone or are going to other parts of Asia and Africa had been animated either by economic or political imperialist motives. They had gone either to accumulate fortunes by means of privilege and protected exploitation. That's what I said about economic expropriation or exploitation. Skip a little bit. The Zionist colonists, on the other hand, were animated by neither impulse. They were driven to the colonization of Palestine by the desire to attain nationhood for themselves and to establish a Jewish state which would be independent of any existing government and subordinate to none. That's actually true. And which would attract to its territory the Jews of the world. Yes, Zionism is to bring Jews back. Okay, well, so far, so good. The second difference is, now here we get to a little problem with history. Other European settlers, regular colonialists, could coexist with the indigenous populations whom they would exploit and dominate, but whose services they would nevertheless require, and whose continuing existence in the coveted territory they would therefore tolerate. He's saying it as if it wasn't so bad. Can you imagine what Gandhi would say at this point? Like, what are you saying? That's not a terrible thing? But the Zionist settlers could not countenance indefinite coexistence with the inhabitants of Palestine, for Palestine was fully populated by Arabs whose national consciousness had already been awakened and who had already begun to nurse aspirations of independence and national fulfillment. Why is this wrong? This is a little review from the first session. First of all, the Arab population of Palestine began to increase after Zionist settlements began to redevelop the land and raise the standard of living. Arabs from elsewhere in the Middle East began to pour in. And secondly, remember when we talked about the two different Hebrew words for settlement, mityashvim versus mitnachalim, the goal of Zionist and then Israeli settlement until 1967 was coexistence, not displacement. He just said the exact opposite. Okay. a little bit later. Britain, actually, let's skip down to the bottom of the page. Page 20, bottom of page 3. The Zionist concept of the final solution to the Arab problem in Palestine and the Nazi concept of the final solution to the Jewish problem in Germany consisted essentially of the same basic ingredient, the elimination of the unwanted human element, okay? The creation of a Jew-free Germany was indeed sought by Nazism through more ruthless and more inhuman methods than was the creation of Arab-free Palestine. At no point was the state of Israel trying to get rid of everyone, and the Arab population, not only in Israel, but even on the West Bank and Gaza, keeps going up. If this is supposed to be genocide, this has to be the most ineffective, inefficient genocide in the history of the world. The opposite. The birth rate keeps going up. And this is an argument which also, it came up during the most recent war in Gaza. The state of Israel is accused of committing genocide while they're bringing vaccines to Arab children in Gaza, while they're bringing food to Arabs, Palestinians in Gaza. I don't recall that being part of Nazi policy to vaccinate the Jews in the camps. It doesn't really fit the standard at all, okay? Now, between this Soviet anti-Zionism and this Arab anti-Zionism, it became something much, much more widespread. Those are really the two main pieces of it. Now, not everyone was convinced by this. It's still, even into the 70s and the 80s, this anti-Zionism, it had a growing following in the Arab world, and it was something very popular in the Soviet Union. Jews were seen, a refusnik like Natan Sharansky was imprisoned for being a Zionist more than he was imprisoned for being a Jew. He was also imprisoned because he wanted to leave. But he was a Zionist betraying the Soviet Union. But there were still many people, and this still was not a mainstream idea. Let me give you an example how even in the 1960s, anti-Zionism was far from being mainstream. Look at text number 13. This is a letter that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote to one of his colleagues in the civil rights movement not long before his assassination in 1960, not long before his assassination. And the letter is called Letter to an Anti-Zionist Friend. He's going to address one of the very questions I raised toward the beginning, the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, because he had a friend, a fellow civil rights activist, who said, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Zionist, and this is what Martin Luther King said. So this isn't me talking, this is Martin Luther King. You declare, my friend, that you do not hate the Jews, you are merely anti-Zionist. And I say, remember, this is Martin Luther King, let the truth ring forth from the highest mountaintops, let it echo through the valleys of God-green earth. When people criticize Zionism, they mean Jews. This is God's own truth. Anti-Semitism, the hatred of the Jewish people, has been and remains a blot on the soul of mankind. In this we are in full agreement. So know also this, anti-Zionist is inherently anti-Semitic and ever will be so. Why is this? You know that Zionism is nothing less than the dream and ideal of the Jewish people returning to live in their own land. The Jewish people, scriptures tells us, once enjoyed it, and so on and so forth. You can finish reading that. That's the point. He said, no, anti-Zionism is another way of criticizing Jews, and Martin Luther King wanted absolutely no part of it. Okay. Let's turn now to the other two questions I wanted to raise. Let's talk about why this has a certain appeal and how to respond to it. Okay. Now, this anti-Zionism, and remember now we're distinguishing old from new, and we're talking about something which was manufactured by Soviet propagandists and then sort of washed through the Arab world by another writer. If it's full of these historical holes, if it's so obviously ahistorical, why does it find more followers? And for our purposes, why has it become so much more mainstream? And it wasn't always this mainstream. Another personal story. When I was a freshman at Michigan, this was in 1982, I lived in East Quad, which of course is the progressive, the the left-wing dorm where the 60s was still going on in 1982. I was a suburban Jewish boy who encountered all these weirdos there. And, it was nice place to live. So one day in East Squad, I was wearing one of my favorite t-shirts, which said in big letters, "I'm proud to be a Zionist." And this guy from East Squad, bigger than me, I should say, I don't know how relevant it is to the story, but he had many piercings and reeked of clove cigarettes. I don't know how relevant that is. I just want you to get an image of what was going on. He came up to me, said, "How can you wear that shirt?" I'm thinking, what is it, torn? Does it smell? What's the problem? I had no idea that there was anything wrong with that shirt. There was anything wrong with it. And he explained to me all the reasons why Zionism is racism and that whole little litany of things which I had never heard before. I had no answer for him, but I went and found out the answers, and the next time he came at me, I had the answers to him. But at that moment, I didn't know what to say. And that speaks to part of the appeal. Let's start with, that segment of the anti-Zionist movement that really concerns us the most. How is it that young Jews are being drawn into this? Why? Well, that was me in 1982. Only now it's a lot more intense. I think there are two different situations here. The majority of young Jews who are being drawn into this anti-Zionist movement are Jews who basically got to college knowing very little about anything Jewish, including Israel and Zionism. They might have known a little bit. They didn't know. And the first substantive, or at least loud thing, the first loud thing they heard about Israel and Zionism was something negative. And of course, at that age, especially on a college campus, the minds are very susceptible. This is an intense environment. And so many of the young Jews who are drawn to it, they have basically a vacuum of knowledge which is being filled by this propaganda, and they don't have the intellectual tools or requisite knowledge to be able to resist it and absorb it without being drawn into it. That was almost me, but I went and found out. That's most of the Jews. But there are a minority of young Jews. I'm not exactly sure how big it is. I'm going to say it's probably 20%, 10 to 20%. These are young Jews who do have a Jewish education. They went to day school and summer camp and maybe K through 12. Day school and summer camp, they learned about Israel all the time. Gesundheit. They learned about Israel all the time, but they really never learned about the problems, the imperfections of Israeli society. That's the way I was taught about Israel. I was taught to love Israel, which is a very good thing. I got to college not knowing that there was anything wrong with the place. Now, mind you, it was 1982. It was before the Intifada, all of those things, but I had no idea. I think in 1982, I didn't know what a Palestinian was. I don't think I ever heard it. I knew a lot about Israel, but not that. And this segment of Jews, they're also unprepared. Now, I would say this. Most Jews who come into that environment with some knowledge and background, the knowledge and background keeps them out. But for some of the Jews, some of young Jews who encounter it, they feel a little bit betrayed by their own education. Why didn't anyone tell me this? In other words, if they had heard something about it before, they might have been able to resist or not be blown away or overwhelmed by it when they eventually heard it. So, that's one segment. Now, when we move beyond young Jews, because there are many young people who are being drawn to it for a different reason. And this, I want to say especially young white people. There is a approach to world history, an approach to basically how understanding of the world, which is called post-colonialism. You may have heard the term post-colonialist. Now let me explain what it is. Originally, this was an academic approach which tried to tell a more complete version of the history of the world, especially in the last couple centuries, by including not only from a point of view of those countries who had colonized the world, Britain, France, other European countries, but also from the vantage point of those people who had been colonized. It was a more well-rounded and complete version of past and present. And when it started out, actually was a really good idea. I remember when post-colonialism became a thing, and I said, great, a richer, a more thickly textured perspective. The problem was, like anything else, when something morphs into its most extreme version, anything, the most extreme version of anything ceases to be constructive and becomes detrimental. And for post-colonialism, what happened was intellectuals involved in post-colonialism, I'm going to generalize and say younger intellectuals, younger academics, they drew a very sharp line between colonizers and colonized, oppressors and oppressed, the line which really hadn't been there before. It originally was a much more fluid way of understanding the world, and when the line was drawn, every people on earth had to be put on one side or the other. It had to be. Now, in a lot of cases, it works. Anyone who's British is on one side of that line without a doubt. That's true of most European countries. Anyone who lives in what once upon a time was known as the Third World was on the other side of the line, but there were situations that didn't quite fit. Jews, it was difficult to understand because Jews looked like the white people from Europe who were the colonizers, but they also had an experience of being colonized. I mean, the land of Israel was colonized by multiple empires in a row, but it happened a long time ago. In more recent history, and many people have a little bit of a difficulty understanding the world before like 30 years ago. It happened a long time ago, so it's sort of been forgotten or pushed aside. And so, for young white people, who are schooled in this more extreme version of post-colonialism, in many ways they're raised with a sense of guilt arising from privilege. You are part of this country, or this is who you are. You have benefited from it, therefore you're guilty of something. And for these young people, supporting the Palestinians and supporting, well, most recently Gaza against Israel is a form of, I don't know what to call it, it's a form of expiation. It's a form of atonement even. Some have called this the cult of Gaza. These are young people who need a way to be forgiven, to atone for the sin of being privileged because they have been told that they've done something wrong, or they've had an unfair advantage, or they can't understand the suffering of others. And by supporting the Palestinian cause and by supporting Gaza against Israel, well, this is a way to do it. I should also make it clear that in this sharp divide, because of this pre-existing, this older notion that Zionism was a form of Western or European colonialism, the state of Israel was placed on that side of the line. And the people being oppressed by the state of Israel was on the other side of the line. So in the first session, one of the first things I said was, this is actually a conflict between two indigenous peoples, but in the language of this more radicalized post-colonialism, this conflict is not only a conflict between colonizers and colonized, it is the ultimate conflict between colonizers and colonized. If you wondered why there's this surge of sympathy and support for the Palestinians being oppressed by this colonialist whatever, but all the other parts of the world where you have formerly colonized people being oppressed, nobody cares. This is the reason, because it's Gaza and the Palestinians that is the focal point of atonement. There was one very capable scholar, Susanna Heschel, who teaches at Dartmouth. She teaches religion, so she really understands religion. She says Gaza has become a kind of Christ figure, where if you support the plight of the Gazans, you are forgiven everything else you've done. But that's the only way to do it. If you support anything else, it doesn't help you. That's the only way to do it. Okay? And this is a very powerful thing. Now, I would also say that all of that, or superscribed onto all of that, and an important part of the way all of this has become mainstreamed is, well, without sounding overly banal, is the effects of social media. And one of the things that's, I could say a lot of things about social media, and social media, let's not lose sight, social media does a lot of good, and there's a lot of things we can do because of it. But in this particular case, one of the unexpected impact or consequences of social media was a misapplication of what was known as the democratization of knowledge. Since the 1990s, what social media was supposed to do was called the democratization of knowledge, meaning giving everyone equal access to knowledge around the world. You didn't have to have a library card or be able to get to a library or to get to an academic library. You could access anything online. And that was a very good thing, believe me. Not having to travel places to go to a particular library or wait for interlibrary loan to bring it is a huge help. But one of the unintended consequences was that the democratization of knowledge wasn't only about access, it was about authenticity and authority. That everyone who writes something online is seen as being equally authoritative and valid as everyone else. It's this large conversation where expertise and experience and knowledge doesn't really matter. The way one person said, you've heard the expression, knowledge is power. Social media is an example where information is the lowest form of knowledge. There's a lot of information, but not a lot out there. And social media encourages people to be far more reflexive when it comes to knowledge than reflective. We need more reflection and a lot less just instantly buying into it. And social media can mainstream anything. It's one of the reasons why beliefs and points of view, which we thought were gone forever, have made this startling comeback, like flat earthers, anti-vaxxers. How did these things come back? It makes no sense. This is something very similar. It mainstreamed this particular idea. Now, it wasn't because of social media, but social media amplified these other tendencies. So that explains why young people are drawn to it, and explains why college campuses are places where it happens. Now, that's not the whole problem, though, because we also have intellectuals who buy into this as well, and this for me is the most confounding. And I'm not sure I have an answer to this, but there are intellectuals, journalists, even historians, well, not so many historians, more journalists than historians, but who are otherwise, in every other issue, they are solid critical thinkers, but when it comes to this conflict and this situation, it's like they have a blind spot. Their ability to think critically just goes out the window. The example to me that really rings true is there's a guy who he has a podcast and writes for the New York Times named Ezra Klein. Now, you can love the New York Times or hate it, but on every subject other than Israel and Gaza, Israel and the Palestinians, this guy's pretty good. I don't always agree with him, but he's a critical thinker. He learns and recalibrates. He looks for the answer. But when he talks about this, it's like there's a switch in his head that switches off. And there's a whole list of people like that, so good on everything, but this, boom, it just disappears. I see it with my students too. When they're in the classroom, excellent critical thinkers. They can really critique things. When they're out of the classroom, they don't. So it is a powerful, has a lot of attractiveness because of decades of propaganda which have generated this sweeping argument amplified by social media. There's one other part of it as well, and it's much easier to embrace a slogan or a mantra which is just a few words than a more complex explanation or understanding. I think the most striking is the claim that Israel is committing genocide. So there's no question war is terrible, and this war has had a lot of civilian casualties, certainly, without a doubt. But the reason that the claim Israel is committing genocide, one of the reasons it resonates is because it's easy to embrace that. I'll be very specific. It's a lot more challenging for someone to say, Israel, the way Israel has conducted this war has resulted in a lot of civilian casualties. Now, that's a question for debate. Could Israel have conducted the war in a way, I don't know, that's a matter of debate, but which is easier to embrace, genocide or conduct of the war in a way which resulted in a lot of civilian casualties? I promise you, the people who are shouting genocide in general, or periodically at me, it's too much effort to embrace the other. Complexity, nuance is more difficult than just shouting a mantra. All right. So that's really in many ways the appeal. Now, the appeal for politicians is the most crass and basic of all. They're just calculating the way to find votes. That's all they're really doing. It's simple. Politicians are the simplest people of all, or their aims are very simple, and this is across the board. They have a calculus. Will this get me more votes or this? And some try to split the difference. So that's the easiest part. But really, it's the campuses that really have become the focal points. And it's, this post-colonialism, I think it's had the most effect and most impact. In my own anecdotal experience, most of my faculty colleagues and the students I know who are embracing this problematic point of view, they're not in disciplines, they're not in the classical disciplines. They're not history majors or econ majors or business majors or science majors. I'll generalize it. They tend to be in majors that have 3 words or more. They tend to be majoring in a post-colonial gendered study of linguistics, whatever that means. But these are watered down disciplines a little bit, and they tend to be heavy on jargon and lighter on substance. Now, that's not true in every case, and like I said, I have not made a study of that. That's just my own anecdotal experience, so take that for what it's worth. Okay. Now, finally, let me conclude to suggest, how do we respond to this? This is the most challenging of all. So the most difficult to respond to is when someone is shouting. They're just shouting slogans, whatever they're shouting, or just yelling or disrupting. That's the most difficult to respond to, because to me, that's a child having a tantrum. Whatever kind of performative thing they're doing, when a child is having a tantrum, parenting 101, there's really nothing to do to stop it. I mean, basically what you can do is to take them out of the room. But the one thing I have found, which is weirdly effective in my own case, when I have someone yelling at me mindlessly, and this is going to sound a little weird, if I gently start singing a song at them, especially a Hebrew song, the one that works for me is when they're coming at me and I sing this. Am Yisrael Chai. It's a nice song, and it confuses them, and I see the confusion. It's like distracting a child from a tantrum. Okay, that does seem to work sometimes. Doesn't always work. I don't know why it works, but it sort of snaps them out of the haze. Now, more easier if you're dealing with someone, and for me it's students or colleagues, whoever, if it's not just yelling, if it's actually engaging in conversation or debate. When I'm dealing with a student, rather than try to overpower them by proving something to them, I always preface whatever I say to students with the phrase, "Don't you think?" I phrase it in the form of a question. Now, the reason that's effective, especially for younger people, is A, young people do not like to be told right and wrong or what to do by grown-ups. I'll give you an example. In 2021, in the previous Gaza war, the Student Senate at Wayne issued this anti-Israel statement. It was highly ahistorical, so my colleague and I who we talk together a lot, we went to their faculty advisor, said, maybe we could sit and do some learning with them and talk about it a little more, give them some background. They refused, and they said, we don't want the grown-ups telling us what to think. So if you phrase it in the form of a question, first of all, you're not telling them what to do. Secondly, if you have the word think in there, they have to think. And secondly, you are giving them I don't know what to call it, not the power in the conversation, but they're in a position where they get to answer the question. But they have to answer a question. That one is very effective. Trying to overpower a young person does not work. They have more stamina, they can last longer. But if you invite them to answer a question, isn't it true that, or don't you think is the best way? That is a great formula to do it. Within our own community, I think we've already begun to find the antidote. And I will admit, as an educator, as someone who's been doing this for a while, we are behind the game. In retrospect, in hindsight, we know we should have started doing this, we should have started teaching about anti-Zionism 20 years ago. In fact, I remember, it's about 20 years ago, the first campus in North America that had this anti-Zionism problem was a campus in Montreal called Concordia, which I had never heard of, although I have camp friends who went there. I didn't think much of it. I said, okay, it's just Concordia. How far can this go? Maybe and then it went to McGill, and then it went to California, and it kept going and going. I wished 20 years ago. So we're a little bit behind the game, but we are starting to catch up because, well, one of the things we have been doing and we need to do is, especially with teaching Jewish children, is we certainly teach Jewish children the importance of loving Israel, with all your heart and all your soul. But when they reach an age where they're able to understand a certain measure of complexity, you say, Israel is wonderful, but there are also these problems, so that they're aware of them and not hearing about these problems for the first time when they get to college or now public high school, hearing it from people who are antagonistic. That is a great way. For those young Jews who want to rebut, it's very helpful. But even for those who don't, just for those who want to be able to absorb this critical point of view. So that makes it possible as well. Finally, on college campuses, those who are most suitable to respond to this, especially when it's emanating from faculty, are other faculty members who have knowledge of this. So on my campus, this is me. On my campus, there is no one who is lucky enough to have the requisite knowledge to be able to respond to them. And basically, you've seen what that response looks like. One of the problems we've had is there are not enough pro-Israel faculty yet who are willing to stand up. For a variety of reasons, it's difficult, especially if you're not tenured yet. There are real consequences. I'm tenured, I'm senior faculty, there is nothing they can do to me. I can speak freely. It's one of the beauties of tenure. It's one of the beauties of tenure. The last thing I will say is, there's those who say that in the face of this antagonism on university campuses, we should leave these university campuses. And I think that is absolutely the wrong way to do it. Absolutely wrong. Our forebears fought too hard to go to school on these campuses. And this is not a time to turn and run. This is a time to stand and debate and engage and basically bank on the fact that these campuses, in their natural equilibrium state, are places of constructive debate, civil discourse. Some of it's gotten sidetracked, but more and more administrators and leaders on campus are restoring order. So, and I mean all campuses. I'm saying even Columbia and Harvard and Penn and the California schools. No, we should not abandon these places. This is a time to stand, and students can do some of it, but the students need their faculty leaders, especially when they're dealing with a faculty member. Because let me tell you, student taking on a faculty member has a huge disadvantage. But when a student hears something from a faculty member and comes and tells me, and I go and confront them, well, let's just say I've had some success doing that. Either I confront the person directly or I talk to their department chair. I feel bad about tattling, but that's just what it is. In other words, there's no reason to do that. So we have this situation, but there is a way forward, and we started. The first way forward is a greater awareness of what the truth is, which makes it easier to underscore how these movements are ahistorical and anti-intellectual, and that's the way forward. Thank you very much. All right. So I do think, I realize it's 9 o'clock, but I do want to, we can take a little time and ask and have some questions. And, and the rule with questions is it can be something from tonight, but it can be something from the whole series. Incidentally, in response to your question, Sam, from last week, I did put some suggested readings at the end of your handout. The readings I chose, these are the people I like to read, but I also chose them because they are centrist, they are sensible, they look at the problem in a complex way, and what they said, they've come up with some very original and powerful ways. I'll just give you one example. Einat Wilf, who I've mentioned, she's pointed out two aspects of the problems moving forward. She's pointed out a phenomenon called Palestinianism, which I've mentioned, where the Palestinian leaders are more interested in destroying a state than building one. And she's also pointed out the importance of what she calls Arab Zionism. There are Israeli Arabs who are actually supportive of the Jews. So I've given you some possibilities. Be critical of who you hear. All right, are there any questions, anything anyone would like to ask at this point? Yes, Sam.
So I'm going to be, but I already have it.
You're going to be, but I didn't hear.
But doing my master's in Jewish education already through KPS, and now going to rabbinical school.
Yes. Yes.
So when anti-Zionism hits the seminary,
Yes.
where future rabbis are, and you are somewhat hushed to say that you believe in the state of Israel.
Right. What do you do with that? Great question. In other words, you're saying if this spreads to the future Jewish leaders, what are we to do? Great question. First of all, is it okay if I rephrase your question? If it reaches the seminary as opposed to when? Because it hasn't reached that institution yet. There was a letter that was written by seminary students against Israel, but it wasn't written by rabbinical students, it was written by undergraduates who should have known better. So that's a very important question, and the responsibility, the burden there, the responsibility is on the faculty of the Jewish Theological Seminary. And I know the faculty pretty well. I know most of them are highly critical of Bibi Netanyahu, but I can't think of a single one who would agree with the delegitimization of the Jewish state. What they can do with these rabbinical students who are going out in the world is basically show them the difference between criticism, being critical on the one hand of the state, and continuing to embrace the legitimacy of Zionism and the state of Israel. It's not that complicated, especially for a rabbinical student. They're not supposed to be narrow thinkers. They're supposed to be quality students. Now, my assumption is, present company included, is the students they're admitting are more than capable of doing this. But that institution, you're right, has real responsibility, as do our major universities. One of the reasons why the fact that this is a problem at Harvard and Penn is not in terms of sheer numbers, is this is where future leaders come from. And that's why it's important for us not to simply relinquish these places. But that's a very good question. And the seminary and the Hebrew Union College and Yeshiva University and the University of Judaism, they have their work cut out. This is a curricular problem. It's not a difficult fix. It's really one required course in Zionism, and they have the people who can teach it. Every one of these, the seminary has at least 2 or 3 people who are basically the same as me. They have these people there who can do it, and the hope is that they will. Now, if it comes to pass that the seminary, the rabbinical students of the Jewish Theological Seminary are becoming anti-Zionist, that's a problem. But I don't think that institution there's simply too long a commitment to Zionism and too deep an understanding of what Zionism is and isn't for them to do it. There are too many good thinkers there. At least that's what I hope. Good question. Yeah. Right. Yes, there's all this money coming in from Kuwait and from Qatar. What are we to do with this? First of all, this is not a new problem. Jews, we have always been a small people, not just with anti-Zionism, but also anti-Semitism, and Jew hatred. We've always been outnumbered and outgunned. Remember, Jews who lived in Christian Europe were dealing with an organization called the Church that was doing this on such a grander scale. And we can't worry ourselves what they're doing. We have to worry ourselves with what we're doing. But we have the infrastructure already to do it. We just have to make the decision to do it. They're going to send what they send. We have to worry about our own first, and then beyond that, to bring the ideas to those spaces where they're bringing ideas. Because sometimes all it takes is one faculty member to blow a hole in all of this. It's tough because the only way it can be prevented, the foreign money coming in, if it's explicitly for propaganda purposes, yes, but the foreign money is not, there's no, in other words, there is the argument, the claim that it's happening, but there's no smoking gun, so to speak. We know the money's coming in, and we know these places are anti-Israel, but no one has been able to show that the money coming in directly is. It's going to departments, it's going to scholarships, it's going to fellowships and prizes. The better way to do it is to channel this money towards constructive debate and for proper research. It depends who's bringing it in. And there's a structural problem where I have colleagues on campus. I have a colleague on campus who is working with the government of Qatar to bring money. But this is someone who's going to make sure that this money is not used for propaganda purposes. It's going to be used for proper education purposes. This is someone who works with me. He actually enlisted me to make sure that it comes in the right way, not the wrong way. So it's not about the money coming in. It's about the money being regulated and, watched when it does come in. Because there's no stopping the money from coming in. I mean, unless they slip up and start bragging what they're good. But no. Much of what they funding, they're also funding medical research. You know what I mean? You can't just stop the money, because a lot of it is doing a lot of good, or at least some of it is. Yeah, Alan.
So you talked about, I'm assuming you're talking about Rashida Tlaib, and she might change and mention now.
I didn't mention her by name.
No, I know.
For the record, no one mentioned her by name.
But the person who succeeded Netanyahu was Naftali Bennett, who was the supporter of the settlements and some of the other right-wing arguments. I think part of this growth of anti-Zionism
Yes.
is that we ignore the near death of the labor Zionists, those who created the state and its democracy, who negotiated the Oslo peace process, who actually withdrew from Lebanon in 1999. Things have changed there. Revisionist Zionism, which the Likud, it was birthed from revisionist Zionism.
Right.
Settles the West Bank, where Jews, I believe, will never be a majority, which is different than labor Zionism, which always said there has to be a Jewish majority. It rejects any move to create a Palestinian state. It rejected the Oslo process, except for a little time that Hebron Accord.
Right.
It works now to weaken democracy by weakening the judiciary and the media. It touches on anti-Arab hatred, which we're already seeing in the Likud campaign, the election which is coming up in October, including against Israel's Arab citizens. It commemorates the Al-Qalena effort and the Irgun. I think if labor Zionism were in charge in Israel, I think anti-Zionism would be much weaker.
So everything you said is 100% correct. So I would say two things based on what I said tonight. First of all, that is all within the realm of proper criticism of the state of Israeli government. Those are all valid criticisms. But it's also an example, what I said earlier, sometimes there's a mentality where if we did better, they would hate us less. That one I have to disagree because, anti-Israel sentiment did not really diminish during the Oslo peace negotiations. It didn't diminish when Arabs in Palestine were offered a territory in 37, 39, 47, when Ben-Gurion offered to give the land back in 67. It would be so nice if it were true that if we simply put a more amicable, a different government in place, that things would be different. For Arafat, for sure, it wouldn't have been any different. It just seems that, and this is what Einat Wilf means by Palestinianism. It doesn't matter what Israel does, and in ways it breaks my heart to say this. All those things don't matter. They want the state to disappear, and they don't care who's running the state that disappears. They want it gone. And I'm not sure there is a party, whether it's left or right or whatever, unless it relinquishes sovereignty or the Jewish, whatever it is, it's not going to make any difference because these things are built on assumptions. One of these assumptions is that the original sin of the state of Israel is not Likud or Kahana or Ben-Gvir, it's Zionism itself. Its original sin is settler colonialism, and the very existence is the nature of that sin. So I wish you were right. I used to believe the same thing, but reality is just beating it out of me. I don't think a left-wing government would still be dealing with these same problems. Golda Meir used to say, well, all they want is for us to be dead and gone. That was Golda. So but all those criticisms are valid criticisms. I don't think any of it would change anything. Yeah. Yes. Great questions. The question is, there are Jews, there are young Jews, there are even a few academics who have been emphasizing Jewish life in the diaspora. Our term for that, in my line of work, we call these diaspora triumphalists. The diaspora is great. We don't need a Jewish state. We just need to find a nice place to go in the diaspora. This found especially fertile ground in America, and it's related to the notion of American exceptionalism. And they'll point to the longevity of the diaspora. And I suppose they have a point. The problem is that diaspora Jewish life, wherever it's been, has always been finite. Jews lived in Spain for 700 years, most of which was really good. Jews lived in Poland 500-600 years, Germany 1,000 years. And one of the reasons they're saying this is because at this point, there's no reason to think that Judaism in America or the Jewish community is going to come to an end. Historically, there's no precedent for that. And sort of the dean or the patron saint of this point of view is a historian named Shaul Magid, who wrote a book about the diaspora. He's very, very good. I personally think he's missing part of the point. You see, what's been more effective for us in the last 100 years, and actually what's in the longer history of Judaism, it isn't diaspora or Israel, it's the two of them together. So even when there was no state, wherever we were in the world, we had this common connection of a Jewish homeland. And in the 20th century, the return of Jewish sovereignty is simply a different balance between the Jewish homeland and the diaspora. And that's been the best. The two of them together is the most effective way, not only for Jews to be in the face of anti-Semitism and persecution, but in the preservation of Jewish identity. Having a homeland, having a language, having that common, it's very important. So, I am skeptical of that. I understand what they're saying, and what they're saying is, let's not give up on the diaspora in our support for the state of Israel, but really where they should be landing is, we can do both. Let's be supportive of the state of Israel, stand behind it, while also continuing to build our own Jewish communities. We don't have to give up one or the other. Turns out we really can do both, even though sometimes doing both is difficult. I think we have time. We'll take 2 more questions. Great question. Organizations that are trying to get camaraderie between, to involve Israeli Arabs, that is absolutely important for so many reasons. I mean, the citizenship and the connection that Israeli Arabs have to the state of Israel, and to the extent that they feel part of it, that is an element of this problem so lost on people in the diaspora. I can't tell you how often when I'm encountering a negative view of the state of Israel, where the first question out of my mouth is, have you ever been there? And those who have never been there, it's not that they don't know, they can't even imagine the concept of an Israeli Arab. So cultivating that relationship is absolutely important. The truth of the matter is, in a sort of unselfconscious grassroots way, it's been going on in a city like Haifa or Jaffa or Akko or many cities in Israel, even some cities on the west. That camaraderie, that coexistence is there. It's not perfect, but it's there. But that is, and it isn't so much doing it is always important, but it's making people, Jews and non-Jews, Jewish and non-Jewish critics of Israel in the diaspora, aware of the existence of Arab Israelis. And it's not just, there's an Arab Israeli on the Supreme Court. I think the more defining example is there are Arab Israelis who serve in the army, who were killed in Gaza, who were killed on October 7th. They're part of Israeli society. The reality is there. It's just a question of letting people know that the realities are. You would not believe how little people know about Israeli Arabs. That's a very important question. One last question. Yes. A college freshman now who comes to campus, well, the 2 organizations on campus that are set up, first of all, Hillel on campus was created for this exact, now it wasn't a reason 100 years ago, now it wasn't anti-Zionism, it was anti-Semitism. This is why Hillel exists. This is their job, and they've done it pretty good. The other is, even Jewish studies faculty who haven't actively engaged, what they've done a great job doing is helping Jewish students. And beyond their own classroom, meeting with Jewish students. So for a freshman, you find Hillel, and you find the Jewish Studies program, and you find that mentor, those faculty members who can help you. So if you have a personal encounter that's anti-Zionist, that one you go to Hillel. If you have an academic encounter, like in a classroom, then you find the me on the campus who will help you. It's my job to do it, and I have to admit, I enjoy doing it. It's very satisfying, how can I say, pounding someone into the ground who has some silly idea. It's my job to do. So both of those things are on pretty much every campus. It's one of our great triumphs that there are so many campuses that have a Jewish Studies program now. 50 years ago, there were like 6. Now there are dozens, virtually everywhere. Okay, really last question. Right.
She claimed we'll call her diversity individual, and she told her not to file a report. And then an entire discovery process has been initiated to prove that the provost, the second most important academic leader at the university, his or her salary was coming from Qatar. And now a federal judge has opened up a discovery mechanism, and they're hoping to reveal how much money Carnegie Mellon has been getting, and they want
It's a perfect model. Thank you. That is exactly what I'm talking about. It is possible to work through the system to combat this in a whole variety of ways. And you can combat it legally, you can combat it, polemically, academically, in a curricular way. The pieces are there, but we're, like I said, we're a little bit behind. The more active and proactive we can be, the better. That is exactly an example of what needs to be done. And if we do that on other campuses, and that has happened on other campuses, that will help us. All right. Thank you very much, everyone.